So what meal are you demanding? Second question I want to ask you is, what about this pain in the midst of crisis? Are you wasting that pain? You know, this is a serious issue for the Israelites because they have basically begun questioning God, that God can take care of them. Why did we ever leave Egypt, they're asking. God, we'd be better off without you, is what they're in essence saying. And so this whole wilderness journey was supposed to be some sort of trust school, that they would lean into God and get to know God and His ways, and that the relationship would grow, but it's sort of falling apart at this moment here in Numbers 11. And I'm not sure who first said the quote, but you've probably heard it, that God doesn't waste anything, and God especially doesn't waste our pain. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, he says, "For our present troubles are quite small and won't last very long, yet they produce an immeasurably great glory that will last forever." You know, there's a question that I like to ask when people are walking through difficult periods, and I always say this is the unanswerable question, but the value is in the question. And here's the question: what do you think God is trying to do through this pain? What do you think God is trying to do through this crisis? So that you can learn to trust Him more. We're in the middle of this pandemic, and I would ask you that question for you, for your family, for those around you. What is God trying to do in the midst of this? What's your sense? You know, it's the pressure, it's the pain that forms us. It's a lot like a diamond that's formed through that pressure. Those are the moments then we're really shaped and our character develops. The third question I want to ask you before I close is, do you recognize discipline as God's love in action? If we look at verse 33, this is a pretty troubling verse here in the passage, but let's look at it. Verse 33, God gives them the quail, and then in verse 33, "But while the meat was still between their teeth, and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and He struck them with a severe plague. And therefore the place was named Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had craved other food." You know, that's a great story to tell kids that are complaining about dinner, the food that you've prepared them for dinner. No, not really. Don't do that. But in chapter 13, we get a sense of why this is such a harsh passage. In chapter 13, we see these spies that are in their midst that incite a rebellion. And so the rebellion against God is about to get a lot worse. And so in Numbers 11, this is basically God kills the complainers. It's this, it sounds harsh, and I don't even attempt to try to take away the tension of that. And you've heard me talk about the violence in the Old Testament before. It's tension that it's hard to resolve. But what we do see is that it's a shot over the bow for Israel. God's using the discipline to try to divert them from an even bigger disaster that's going to happen a few chapters later when they get up to the promised land and the spies among them turn their opinion and they end up wandering back into the wilderness, and that generation largely dies before the next generation will ever come into the promised land. So God's using that discipline to try to prepare them. 1 Corinthians 10, Paul writes in verse 10, "And don't grumble as some of them did. For that is why God sent His angel of death to destroy them." And all these events happened to them as examples for us. They were written down to warn us who live at the time when this age is drawing to a close. Their role in the middle of that, I would hate for God to pull up my name in the history books and say, "See, I used his life as a lesson for what you were not supposed to do." The discipline came at a really tough price for Israel. But what if the discipline that you see in your life, and maybe it's tough discipline, maybe you even see some of what's happening now in this virus as a discipline, what if you see it as an act of God's love, that He's preparing you for something in the future, or maybe preparing you so that you don't make a mistake in the future? And so could you trust Him enough to believe that whatever you're going through, that He's going to use it for your good, and your job is to trust Him, to obey Him, to lean into Him, and trust that God knows what He's doing, even when it hurts. One of my favorite quotes, it comes from Henry Cloud, is that God, sometimes it will hurt, but he's not trying to harm us. It's kind of the difference between I go to my dentist and the dentist doesn't harm me. It may hurt for a while, but ultimately the dentist is bringing me healing, so he's not harming me. And that's God's practice so often. Something may hurt and we may not get what we want immediately.